that the family is going to be willing to turn over the phone as part of that investigation.
For weeks, the Nolan Wells case has revolved around one question that investigators still have not publicly answered. What happened to the 18-year-old college football player after he remained behind on Horn Island following a July 4th boating trip? Now, another question has suddenly moved to the center of the investigation, and this one concerns something much more tangible: Nolan's cell phone. During a discussion on Dan Abrams' Sirius XM program, an attorney representing two of Nolan's friends made a serious allegation. He said he believed Nolan's family had not turned the phone over to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, despite earlier expectations that the device would be made available for examination.
I saw a headline a few weeks back that said Ben Crump and the family is going to allow the Jackson County Sheriff's Office access to Nolan's phone. You know what I never heard? I never heard him follow through with that. I have reason to believe, and I do believe, that they have not cooperated with law enforcement. I do not think that they have turned in Nolan's phone. And I'm willing to bet my reputation on it. I don't think they've cooperated at all. They do not have Nolan's phone. They haven't had access to Nolan's phone. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department has it. So how can you say that there's text missing or there's photographs missing? Our boys had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than give it back to Christine and her friends later that night.
If that claim were accurate, it could raise significant questions about potentially important evidence in a case where the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death remained unresolved. But there was an important distinction from the beginning. The allegation came from an attorney representing Nolan's friends. It was not presented as an established finding by investigators. At the time of the discussion, the state's official autopsy and toxicology results had not been publicly released. The case was expected to go before a Mississippi grand jury for consideration of possible criminal charges, and authorities had not publicly established exactly how Nolan died, what caused his death, or whether a crime had occurred. Nolan had been found dead on July 6th, 2 days after the July 4th trip to Horn Island. His family had demanded answers and called for a thorough investigation. They retained attorney Ben Crump to conduct an independent investigation while the Jackson County Sheriff's Office continued its own inquiry. That meant 2 investigative efforts were already underway. But Nolan's friends had also begun taking legal steps of their own. Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour, who were connected to Nolan during the July 4th trip, had hired attorneys. According to the discussion, Hudson and Patalo later returned to Horn Island with lawyers J. Tyler Cox and Edward Andrew Paltic. Their stated purpose was to understand the island itself, its layout, the surrounding conditions, and the environment where the events had taken place. Their attorneys were also responding to accusations that had spread online, suggesting Nolan's friends may have somehow been involved in his death. Those accusations had not been established by authorities. The young men denied wrongdoing, and their attorneys had reportedly discussed possible defamation actions against people they believed were spreading false information about their clients. The friends had also appeared publicly on Brandon Tatum's program. Patalo criticized Nolan's mother, Christine, over what he described as the way their identities had been exposed and discussed online. He argued that the situation had grown beyond what the available facts supported. Hudson expressed a different kind of regret, saying he wished they had never gone out to Horn Island. But none of those statements answered the central question. What happened to Nolan after his friends last saw him? That question remained unanswered when the phone issue surfaced on Dan Abrams' Sirius XM show. A caller named Mo raised questions about Nolan's phone and about photographs that were allegedly circulating. The caller claimed there were concerns about missing messages and suggested that photographs showed adults on the boat, despite the public description of the group involving young people.
Let's go to Mo in Houston. Mo, how you doing? What do you got?
Hey, Dan, love the show. I appreciate you gentlemen for coming on as well.
Thank you.
A couple quick things. Was Nolan Wells, were there messages missing out of his phone? And the second thing is
Absolutely
photos
not.
have come out. Yeah, they were. Yeah, they're saying that there were messages missing off of his phone. His phone was wiped, and another thing, there's pictures of, like with the modern day with people with cell phones and social media. There's pictures with adults on that boat. There, and one of the adults they're even saying is like an affluent crowd, judge, businessman. They were saying there's just kids, but there are adults there.
Yeah. Right, but here's the thing that they're saying. I don't know who the they is, but go ahead. Tyler, you want to take this one? Or
yeah,
Ed?
I'd love to.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I saw a headline a few weeks back that said Ben Crump and the family is going to allow the Jackson County Sheriff's Office access to Nolan's phone. You know what I never heard? I never heard him follow through with that. I have reason to believe, and I do believe, that they have not cooperated with law enforcement. I do not think that they have turned in Nolan's phone. And I'm willing to bet my reputation on that. I don't think they've cooperated at all. They do not have Nolan's phone. They haven't had access to Nolan's phone. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department has it. So how can you say that there's text missing or there's photographs missing? Our boys had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than give it back to Christine and her friends later that night. So anything about missing text messages or Snapchats is completely false.
Those were claims made during the discussion, not established findings. But the conversation quickly moved toward information that had already been reported about Nolan's phone. Nolan's mother had reportedly said that when the family recovered the device, she was able to track it using Life 360. She also reportedly raised concerns that photographs and videos associated with Nolan's Snapchat accounts were no longer present. That created an obvious question. Had information been deleted from Nolan's phone? And if something was missing, when had it disappeared? The concern became more significant when combined with reports that Nolan's family had issued subpoenas involving several technology and social media companies, including Snapchat, WhatsApp, TikTok, Meta, and Life 360. Those efforts were part of the family's independent investigation into what happened to Nolan. There had also been an expectation that the phone would eventually be examined by both sides. According to statements attributed to Ben Crump, his team and law enforcement were expected to conduct a mutual inspection of Nolan's phone.
Several major tech companies to try to get records of Nolan's social media accounts. Is that accurate? And if true, why do you think that was necessary to even take that step?
It is true. Our team has subpoenaed many of the social media records of Nolan, the phone records. We want to preserve evidence, Laura Coates. You know, as an attorney, it's so important to preserve evidence that it's about you don't know what is going to be relevant. You don't know what is going to help answer the lingering questions that Christine and Elmore and their family want so desperately. So we're in a ferocious search for the truth. And we have been unrelenting, and we're going to continue to zealously go after the truth.
Former law enforcement experts working with the family were reportedly going to assist with the phone download so that the information could be reviewed by those involved. On paper, that seemed like a straightforward way to address the questions. Examine the device, recover the available data, determine what was actually there. Then, compare that information with the established timeline. But attorney Tyler Cox challenged the idea that this had happened. When asked about Nolan's phone, Cox said he believed Nolan's family had not cooperated with law enforcement by turning the device over. He referred to reports that Ben Crump and the family were going to give the Jackson County Sheriff's Office access to the phone. According to Cox, he had never seen that follow through. He said he believed the family had not cooperated with authorities and had not turned Nolan's phone over. Then came the statement that immediately drew attention. Cox said he was willing to stake his reputation on that belief. But his account contained another important detail. He said the Jackson County Sheriff's Department had Nolan's phone, and that created a contradiction that could not simply be brushed aside. If the Sheriff's Department had the phone, how could anyone know that messages or photographs were missing? And if the family had not turned the phone over, as Cox alleged, how had law enforcement obtained it? Those questions required something more than competing statements. They required evidence establishing the phone's chain of custody and what information was actually contained on it. Cox also rejected the suggestion that Nolan's friends had altered the device. He said the young men had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than return it to Christine and her friends later that night. That directly challenged the suggestion that Nolan's friends had wiped or manipulated information. But it also left the public with an increasingly complicated picture. There were questions about missing messages, questions about missing photographs, questions about who possessed the phone, questions about whether law enforcement had access to it. And now, an attorney was publicly accusing Nolan's family of failing to cooperate with investigators. Dan Abrams then weighed in. Abrams said he was surprised by Cox's statement because he had not expected the attorneys to reveal something that could potentially become a significant development in the case.
I mean, I was stunned when they said it, right? I mean, when I invited them on the show, I didn't really think they were going to break news. I thought they were going to more talk about the defamation lawsuits that they were talking about, et cetera. But when he said that, I sort of paused and I was like, whoa, wait a second. He's accusing them of withholding evidence from the investigation. And sort of that's what everyone is calling for, right? Which is everyone saying, let the investigation proceed. Let's see what the investigation turns up. And you gotta hope that the family is going to be willing to turn over the phone as part of that investigation.
The allegation was serious. If Nolan's family had actually withheld a potentially important piece of evidence from investigators, that would raise obvious concerns about the completeness of the investigation. But Abrams also pointed out that the situation was more complicated. Authorities had previously indicated that they did not believe there was evidence of foul play, while continuing to investigate the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death. And there was no indication that law enforcement was investigating Nolan's family for wrongdoing. The family, after all, was publicly demanding that the case be investigated thoroughly. That raised another question. If the family believed authorities were not conducting a sufficiently thorough investigation, could that explain why they wanted to control their own examination of Nolan's phone? And could authorities simply force them to surrender the device? Abrams noted that investigators could potentially seek a warrant, but he also acknowledged the unusual position created if Nolan's family was simultaneously calling for a complete investigation, while allegedly withholding evidence from the same investigators they wanted to find answers. That tension was becoming impossible to ignore, because now this was no longer simply a question about Nolan's final moments. It was a question about the evidence itself. Who had it? Who had examined it? What did it contain? And could the information on Nolan's phone help establish what happened before he was found dead? Those questions remained unresolved. And while the phone controversy was unfolding, another part of the case was becoming increasingly important. The decision by Nolan's friends and their attorneys to return to the island where everything began. According to their attorneys, the trip back to Horn Island was not an attempt to solve the case themselves. It was about understanding the place. Their lawyers wanted to see the island firsthand, to understand its layout and surrounding conditions, and to become familiar with the environment their clients had described. That distinction mattered, because Horn Island is not necessarily a place where someone who stays behind has no way to leave. People travel there by boat. They arrive, spend time on the island, and depart again. For the attorneys representing Nolan's friends, understanding that environment could help them evaluate their clients' accounts and prepare for possible legal action. Their clients maintained that they did not know what happened to Nolan after they last saw him that afternoon. So, the attorneys wanted to see the place for themselves. They wanted to understand where Nolan had been, where people could move, what the surrounding water was like, and what possibilities existed for someone who remained on the island after another group departed. But the more closely the lawyers examined the circumstances, the more difficult one part of the story became. There were people around, there were boats coming and going, yet Nolan was eventually found dead, and there was still no clear public account of what happened during the period after his last known interaction with the people who had been with him. That gap in the timeline was one of the most important unresolved issues in the case, and it was also the point where legitimate questions could easily become something else. Online, accusations had already begun circulating about Nolan's friends, but Dan Abrams emphasized that there was a difference between having questions about a case and having evidence that someone committed a crime. That distinction became particularly important because Nolan's friends had taken an unusually public approach to defending themselves. They had hired attorneys, they had spoken publicly, and they had returned to Horn Island with their lawyers. Their attorneys were also discussing possible defamation lawsuits against people they believed had spread false information about their clients. From Abrams' perspective, there was something noteworthy about that strategy. If Nolan's friends had actually been involved in something incriminating, voluntarily putting themselves and their attorneys into the public conversation could potentially create additional exposure. Public interviews could generate more questions, litigation could lead to discovery, and further scrutiny could potentially uncover evidence that someone wanted to keep hidden. Their attorney made essentially that argument, but even that could not settle the case. People behave differently under pressure. A public appearance can be strategic, a lawsuit can be strategic, silence can be strategic. None of those choices by themselves establish whether someone is telling the truth. The evidence still has to do that, and according to Abrams, that was the most important thing missing from the growing public debate. In a high-profile investigation, suspicion often becomes more credible when investigators uncover contradictions. A witness gives one account, then another. A person's explanation conflicts with physical evidence. A timeline does not work. A piece of evidence contradicts what someone previously claimed. Those inconsistencies can change the direction of a case. But Abrams argued that, at that point, he had not seen a contradiction of that kind that clearly established that Nolan's friends were lying about what happened. There were certainly questions. People questioned the emergency call for help. They questioned why Nolan's phone was on the boat. They questioned why Nolan remained on Horn Island. They questioned what happened after his friends left. But none of those questions automatically proved that Nolan's friends were responsible for his death. That distinction became even more important when considering the most serious theory being discussed publicly. Suppose, hypothetically, that Nolan had gotten into some kind of argument or confrontation with his friends before they left. His friends denied that such a confrontation occurred. But even if that scenario were true, Abrams pointed out that it would not automatically amount to murder or manslaughter. Leaving someone behind could be irresponsible. It could raise serious questions. It could potentially be relevant to an investigation. But Horn Island is a place where people routinely arrive and depart by boat. It is not necessarily a situation where someone left behind has no possible way of getting off the island. That meant even the hypothetical scenario being discussed did not, by itself, establish criminal responsibility for Nolan's death. And there was another problem. If there had been a serious confrontation involving Nolan and his friends, there were potentially other people who could have witnessed it. There were multiple people in the area. There were other boats. There were people who could potentially have seen or heard what happened. Yet no evidence discussed in the program established that witnesses had come forward saying they saw Nolan's friends prevent him from returning to the boat. That did not prove nothing happened. It simply meant that the public could not fill the gap with assumptions. And that was becoming increasingly important as the case drew more attention. Because Nolan's death had become much more than a local investigation. It was becoming a national conversation. And part of that conversation involved race. Nolan was black. The friends who had been with him were white. Abrams argued that this racial difference was influencing the way some people were interpreting the evidence. That did not mean Nolan's family should stop asking questions. It did not mean their concerns were illegitimate. And it did not mean that hiring Ben Crump was evidence of wrongdoing. A family can believe that an investigation needs more scrutiny without already knowing what the final answer will be. Nolan's family had every reason to want a complete explanation for what happened to their son. At the same time, Nolan's friends had the right to defend themselves against accusations they said were false. Both things could be true, and neither side's position could substitute for evidence. That became the central challenge. The public wanted to know what happened to Nolan. His family wanted investigators to leave no question unanswered. His friends wanted the accusations against them to stop, and law enforcement still had to determine what could actually be established. But among all the unanswered questions, one stood out as particularly difficult to understand. If Nolan's death was an accident, if he ultimately drowned after remaining on Horn Island, why did nobody see him in distress? That question did not necessarily point toward Nolan's friends. The absence of a witness who saw Nolan in distress was a mystery about Nolan's final hours. It was not, by itself, evidence against the people who had been with him earlier. Still, it mattered. Because if Nolan had remained on the island, there had to be a sequence of events that followed. Nolan had reportedly spoken with a woman there. That interaction was not described as lasting very long. Then Nolan remained on the island, and after that, the publicly known timeline became much less clear. What happened next? Where did Nolan go? Who, if anyone, saw him? Did he attempt to leave? Did another boat come into the area? What happened between the last known moment and the discovery of his body? Those questions remained open. And that was why the investigation had to keep those issues separate. The mystery of Nolan's final hours was one question. The suspicion surrounding his friends was another. They overlapped, but they were not the same. To determine whether Nolan's friends had committed a crime, investigators would need evidence connecting them to one. To determine what happened to Nolan after they left, investigators needed to reconstruct his movements and establish the events that followed. And that reconstruction would require more than interviews and speculation. It would require the available digital evidence, witness accounts, physical evidence, and eventually, the official medical findings. Because until those pieces could be placed together, the public was still looking at an incomplete timeline. And the phone controversy had only made that uncertainty more pronounced. If the device contained information about Nolan's final communications or movements, it could potentially answer some of those questions. But even the phone could not explain everything. There was still the island, still the people who were there, still the emergency call, still the unexplained period before Nolan was found, and still the most fundamental question of all. How did Nolan Wells die? At the time of the discussion, even that had not been definitively answered publicly. The official autopsy and toxicology findings were still pending, and what those reports eventually revealed could change the entire direction of the case. If the medical evidence pointed toward an accident, one set of questions would remain. If it pointed toward something else, the investigation could take an entirely different path. Either way, the next major development would have to come from evidence that had not yet been fully released. And until that happened, the Nolan Wells case remained suspended between what people believed had happened and what investigators could actually prove. The phone could potentially answer some questions. The medical findings could answer others. Witness accounts could strengthen or weaken the competing versions of events. And the physical evidence would have to fit somewhere inside the story. That was the only path forward. Not the loudest theory, not the most popular accusation, not what people on social media believed had happened. The evidence. Because once the attention surrounding the case began to fade, the interviews would end. The online arguments would move on, and the competing theories would eventually be replaced by something else. But the evidence would remain. And for Nolan's family, that evidence mattered for a reason far more serious than public curiosity. Their son was gone. They wanted to know how. They wanted to know why. And they wanted to know what happened during the final hours of his life. For Nolan's friends, the stakes were different. They were facing public accusations that they said were false, and they had hired attorneys to defend themselves and challenge claims they believed were unsupported. For investigators, the responsibility was different again. They had to separate those competing narratives from the facts and determine what could actually be established. That meant following the evidence wherever it led, even if it contradicted the assumptions people had already made. And that is ultimately what makes the Nolan Wells case so difficult. There are legitimate questions. There are competing accounts. There are allegations. There are unanswered gaps in the timeline. But an unanswered question is not automatically proof of a crime. And an allegation does not become fact simply because it is repeated. Until the evidence closes the gap between Nolan's final known moments and the discovery of his body, the most honest conclusion remains the simplest one. We still do not know exactly what happened to Nolan Wells. What we do know is that an 18-year-old went to Horn Island on July 4th and was found dead 2 days later. His family continues to seek answers. His friends continue to deny wrongdoing. Attorneys on both sides continue to examine the circumstances from very different perspectives, and investigators remain responsible for determining what the evidence can prove. The mystery is not solved simply because theories exist, and it cannot be solved simply because one explanation feels more convincing than another. Eventually, the evidence will have to decide, because when the interviews stop, the headlines disappear, and the speculation fades, one question will remain: what really happened to Nolan Wells?